This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject will be unexplained phenomena and why people believe in things that seemingly have rational explanations. I have two experts that will handle this topic, and we'll get going in a moment. As I mentioned, the topic is the unexplained. Some people would call it PSI psi phenomena, the paranormal, the supernatural. On the left of the screen, you'll see Matthew Lowry. On the right, James Underdown. And as I usually do, I like to give my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves, talk about themselves, what drew them to the topic, and if they have any websites or books that they have written about the subject. So let me start with Matt on the left. If you could give a little bit of a background about yourself and your interest in the unexplained.
Yeah, my name's Matt Lowry, and I'm a physics professor. I teach physics at both the high school and the college level, and I have a blog that I write. It's called The Skeptical Teacher, www.skepticalteacher.org, where I kind of muse on topics like this. And I think one of the things that got me interested in these topics from a more skeptical point of view is the fact that I think it's my science background. And in my science training, I've always been fascinated by kind of like the boundaries of science, all the cutting edge stuff that's right out there where, it's kind of a gray zone. It hasn't been fully figured out yet. Questions like, how big is the universe? Where did it come from? And so on and so forth, things like that. And I think a lot of those types of questions are really appealing to everybody. As for me, I've found that I think science is the best way to address those questions. And as I started to learn more about science and whatnot, you hear all these stories about things like paranormal phenomena and people with mental telepathy and so on. And I think the thing that really got me into addressing these questions or thinking about them from a skeptical viewpoint was when I was an undergraduate and in graduate school, I read a book written by Carl Sagan called The Demon Haunted World.
Yeah.
And that book really crystallized a lot of things for me in the terms of why being skeptical of kind of extraordinary claims is important. Not that you dismiss them outright, but you don't accept them outright either. You investigate them, you demand evidence, and so on. And as Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And then that led me to learning about the Skeptical Inquirer magazine, led me to learning about the Center for Inquiry, led me to the writings of James Randi and his organization, the James Randi Educational Foundation. And that's sort of how I got into all this. And of course, I've met James before, and I got to the point where I was talking about this stuff so much that my wife one day looked at me and said, you should really start a blog. And I said, no, that's a crazy idea. And then 3 days later, I went back to her and said, okay, how do I start a blog? And 7 years later, I'm still blogging. So, and here I am. So there you go.
Okay, and let me just ask before I go on to James, did you ever have in your past life, like live in a neighborhood that had a haunted house, or did you see a UFO, or you're out camping and heard something and someone said, oh, that's a Bigfoot, or that's a chupacabra, or something?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've got a really good story on this. I, of course, like everybody else, I've seen things that, could be labeled as unexplained.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the thing that's really important to understand is when you see something that is unexplained or unidentified. Let's say, for example, a UFO. That is exactly what it's defined as, an unidentified object.
Right.
That doesn't mean that you can automatically jump to say, oh, it's a ghost or it's an alien spacecraft. All it means is that you don't know what it is. So I've always found it very interesting when people kind of reason that way, where they say, oh, there's this thing, it's unidentified, it's unexplained, I don't know what it is, so therefore it's this. because it seems there's like to be a fundamental breakdown in logic. And my real quick story on this, I could talk at length about this, but I'll give you the quick version.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, I had a group of friends, and we liked to go hang out at this local graveyard because, we're weird high school kids, right? And one night, a couple of my friends were hanging out at the graveyard. I wasn't there. And they swear they had a paranormal experience. They swear they saw a ghost. And I think this is one of the things that really kind of got me into skepticism, and it's something that kind of was bubbling underneath, and then Carl Sagan's book really brought it to the surface for me. Because what happened is a large number of people in my group of friends, they just kind of took this claim at face value, and then the next thing you know, more and more of them were having these paranormal experiences, and as I like to say, the fish kept getting bigger and bigger with every telling of the tale. Yeah. And it just got really ludicrous. And they were getting to the point where they were doing really stupid things based upon these claims. Meanwhile, myself and a few other people, we were in the minority in the circle of friends, we were very skeptical. We're like, well, what's going on here? And I actually asked a lot of questions, and I actually tested out some of their claims, and I found that they didn't hold any water. And I actually ended up figuring out what it was that they saw. I figured out that what they'd actually seen is they didn't see a ghost. And what they saw was a gravestone that was underneath a tree, and the moonlight was casting a shadow on this gravestone in such a manner that it made it look kind of like a humanoid figure. Yeah. And their imaginations basically filled in the rest. And I actually, in the course of my investigations, figured out what it was they really did see, but they refused to believe me. Right. Even though it was very clearly outlined and so on and so forth. I was then vindicated many years later because many years later one of the principal players, who's one of the believers in the ghost stories and whatnot, came to me and said, well, yeah, we actually kind of made it all up. Yeah. I was like, well, I could have told you that. Yeah. I figured it out. But that was sort of my story.
Well, that's sort of the basic real topic of this, is the will of humans to believe something. But let me turn to James Underdown, my other guest. Let me get a little bit of background about you, and if like Matt, you also have a story of a haunted house, some other kind of experience. So a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm the executive director of the Center for Inquiry in Los Angeles. And the Center for Inquiry is a nonprofit educational organization that publishes 2 magazines. Free Inquiry magazine deals with the philosophy of secular humanism, and Skeptical Inquirer magazine, which Matt mentioned earlier, deals with claims of the paranormal and extraordinary claims. Skeptical Inquirer is sort of the ancestor of the Center for Inquiry, or the CSICOP, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, which Carl Sagan was also a part of.
Is that the Shermer organization or Randy's organization?
No, that predates Randy. Randy was with us for a long time. CSICOP was the original publisher of Skeptical Inquirer. That started in '76, and that was a bunch of writers and scientists and other thinkers who got together and wanted to start answering some of these wild claims that were going around in the 60s and 70s, and try to use scientific techniques to look into what was happening and why people were having these experiences. So, and then I also created a group in 2000 called the Independent Investigations Group. And our team are a bunch of skeptical investigators using science to look into some of these claims. And we offer $100,000 for anyone who can prove paranormal ability. And we've been testing people for over 16 years now.
Now, when you say that, do you mean you're more concerned with ESP? Or, for example, if someone came with, say, a dead, rotting tissue from a Bigfoot, would that win the $100,000?
if it turned out to be a strain of DNA that was non-existent on the Earth, and then they also produced the body the sample came from, yeah, that would probably count.
Okay.
But what we do a whole wide variety. I mean, we've done everything from ghosts and ESP to remote viewing, dowsing, medical claims, all perpetual motion, all kinds of different stuff.
Yeah. Now, I want to a little later in the show, I'll talk about a couple of experiences as a child that I had in the same vein that Matt was talking about. But I want to get to why I wanted to do this show, and that's because a few months ago I was looking online and seeing there's a lot of these YouTube channels, you know, unexplained phenomena or photographs that cannot be explained, and they're very easily explained. And yet I do these shows, and you know, I'll get a few hundred hits after few hundred views after 6 months, and yet someone will post some photograph, like there's a famous photograph of 4 or 5 kids from the late 70s, and there's like a hand from a kid who's hiding behind with a thumb going up, and people are like, they can't explain what happened there. And I want to talk a little bit about how the 21st century has sort of rocketed this belief in a lot of crap. And let me talk about something that's definitely, you know, fictive, and that's the Slender Man thing. That's when I saw this, and these couple of young girls a year or two ago who stabbed one of their a girl, I think it was in Cleveland or someplace, because the Slender Man did it. And the odd thing is, this is actually goes back to 08 or 09. Someone on one of these called creepypasta sites decided we're going to have the Slender Man, this mythos, and they went back, and there's a lot of photoshopped photographs going back supposedly 100+ years of supposed Slender Man sightings, but it all dates to one thing that's definitively provable. The guy who created the mythos in 08 or 09 has never denied it, but yet people, despite that, want to believe that there has been, not only that there is a Slender Man, but that this mythos has been for 50 or 100 or more years. And so what do you think impels people to do that? Because similarly, if we go back before the internet era, a lot of, if you look at things like Paul Bunyan, the legend of Paul Bunyan, this started out as a legend created by an actual company in the early 20th century. If you look at like Bigfoot didn't really get going until the 1960s. There had been some claims, but a lot of that overblown. So what do you think drives this will to believe, even in the face of definitive evidence that this was started at a particular person at a particular time?
Well, I mean, I would say, for starters, these are good stories. I mean, they're fun stories. Some of it gets, you know, it gets launched into the stratosphere when you come up with a film. I mean, the famous film with the Bigfoot was called the Patterson film.
Yeah, Patterson-Gimlin.
This guy was, so he's loping away, and it just spurs people's imaginations, you know, and especially back when that happened, people were less aware of how easy it is to fake things like this. And that, incidentally, goes back a century. You know, Arthur Conan Doyle was fooled by these 2 little girls in England who faked called the Cottingley fairies, and they cut out some pictures of pixies out of a book and pinned them up and stuck them around in the woods by their house. And Arthur Conan Doyle fell for it. So, you know, they're intriguing stories, and they're fun to think about, and that goes a long way into spreading the ideas and the rumors.
Yeah.
I think Jim makes a really good point here about sort of the imagination aspect to it, and he's right. You know, they're really cool stories. You know, kind of back to what I was talking about before with my my teenage experiences with these ghost stories, and a lot of my friends buying into it. It was a very imaginative story, and it got more and more exciting and crazy the longer it went. And I think, I don't know, at least I like to use that as an example, because I think part of it was what was happening is you had sort of a group identity that was forming among these people who had all kind of bought into this belief, and that gives them a feeling of community. And I think you can say that sort of happens in the broader sense because a lot of people are into the paranormal or the Bigfoot hunting or so on and so forth. There is kind of this sense of, oh, I'm part of this bigger community. But I think also part of it is, at least this is kind of what I observed with my friends back in the day when they had the ghost stories going on. And I see similar things with, other believers in the paranormal and whatnot. I think for some people, it gives them a sense of being connected to something bigger than themselves, right? So the person that really believes that they have psychic abilities, for example, we're not talking about the Sylvia Brown charlatan types. We're talking about the true believers. Somebody who really does believe that they have these psychic abilities. They may go to someone like James and the IIG, and they really do believe that they can do it. And then when they get tested and it doesn't work, they're just crestfallen because they've built up this sort of worldview where they're elevated to having a connection to the cosmos or something because of this ability that they believe that they had that they don't actually have. And I think that kind of plays a lot into this, because I think a lot of people want to believe that they do have that kind of connection, that they are part of something bigger. I mean, we all want to believe that to a certain degree or another. And for some people, I think this is their way of accessing that sort of connection that they're seeking.
Yeah, the thing that I find too is that if you ask any forensic specialist in dealing with crimes and memories, and they'll all tell you human beings are the worst witnesses. Many tests have been done where someone, a professor's giving a lecture, someone bursts into the room, runs off with something of his, and well, was it a white man? Was it a Hispanic man? Did he take the professor's hat or his attaché case? And if you have 100 people there, you're probably going to get at least 25 or 30 different versions. And yet you look at something, for example, like alien abductions, and they're so pat. It's always, we need the semen, we need the ovum, we have our race is dying. These are classic 1950s tropes. The Betty and Barney Hill thing came only a few weeks after. I think there was a guy online whose name slips my mind, who did a really brilliant analysis of the Betty and Barney Hill thing. 3 consecutive episodes of The Outer Limits that had 3 separate aliens that were all had features in the Hill story. And then the 1980s, you had Satanists, the Geraldo Rivera, Phil Don, all the Satanists, the same thing. And all of this fits into that same pattern of some beings from beyond, whether they're priests from some Illuminati or aliens or angels or whatnot, doing the same thing. And the very fact that the stories are so similar, to me, actually works against it being real, because these are projections that everyone has the same kind of reaction to a similar stimuli. Whereas if something was real and happening in the real world, well, some aliens would be green and bug-eyed. Others would be the gray aliens with black eyes. Other ones would be this, that, and the other thing. I think because of memory being fallible in humans, the fact that you get a lot of these tales of these things where it's so similar works against it. James, you were going to say something before.
Two things. I mean, we just gave an award to a couple of 8th graders in Orange County at a science fair who did an experiment about short-term and long-term reliability of eyewitness testimony.
Yeah.
So they showed a video to a bunch of people, and the people filled out a questionnaire about the video immediately after seeing it, and scored 60% on the answers.
Wow.
Right after seeing it. Then they went back in 2 weeks and asked them, and they were scoring in the 20-some%.
Yeah.
So Matt's right. I mean, eyewitnesses are horrible sources of information. The other thing I wanted to mention was, a lot of this, I always try to get a feel for what a person's overall orientation is to the world. Is your relation to the world filled with the supernatural and the paranormal. When you hear a bump in your attic at night, does your mind go immediately to a ghost or to a squirrel?
Yeah.
So, you know, those, you sort of shoehorn your orientation or your worldview, you shoehorn your experiences into this pre-existing set of expectations.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot case, and let's end this first segment, I guess, talking about that. The thing I find interesting about it is there's a fellow who claimed to have been the guy in the suit, and when you actually look at the guy, I've seen photos online of him supposedly walking, even 40-some years later. I mean, it's the dead exact gait. He swings his arm in the exact manner. His legs bend in the same way. But yet, when you listen to people, and even both on the pro and con, the debunking and the believer side, is they see what they want in the film. For example, people who think it's a fake will look at that thing and they'll claim that there's a zipper down the back. Now, I've watched that and I don't see a zipper. The believers believe it's a female Bigfoot because they see breasts there. And I don't see anything that's remotely like breasts on the suit or the creature or whatever it was. And so it's like both sides are imbuing things into this film, which is I think only 17, maybe 25 seconds long, if that. And yet when you look at it with fresh eyes, it's like, okay, you know, this seems rather obviously fake. So maybe if Matt, if you want to take that, the idea of people on either side just seeing what they want in the evidence.
Well, I think that's a very good point, and I think it's very true. We all have, as Jim was just mentioning, we all have sort of a way we look at the world. None of us ever comes looking at the world in what I guess you could call a truly objective sense. We all have sort of this background, lens through which we see the world. And that's one of the reasons why I think science is such an invaluable endeavor, because science is a process which is designed specifically, when it's done correctly, to do everything you can to weed out all of that subjectivity and all that bias. That's the whole point of it. That's why peer review in science and all of these other safeguards are so critical. Because skeptics and believers and people who are just apathetic about these issues, we all have the same problem. We all see things through a specific lens. So you're right. The people who are skeptical may immediately dismiss something like the Bigfoot film, or people who believe it will say, "Oh yes, this is just yet more evidence." And I think the tricky thing of it is that if you really are going to make progress in terms of breaching that communication divide between the skeptics on the one hand and the believers on the other, and you're going to have meaningful communication, there has to be sort of some kind of common ground to start from. I'll give you a good example of this. There's a gentleman, oh my gosh, I can't remember his full name, but I met him in Minnesota a few years ago. He runs a paranormal radio show called Darkness Radio, and I honestly can't remember his name. I feel so bad. It's slipped my mind. It's Dave Schrader. I think that's it. Dave Schrader is the guy's name, I think. Dave, if you see this and I get your name wrong, I apologize. Dave and I met at a conference, or a convention, and there was sort of a skeptic track at the convention. There was also a paranormal track, and he did a presentation on ghost hunting. And I went to it. I was interested in seeing what he had to say, and I took a lot of copious notes. And I have to say, he's a very nice guy. He's a very engaging speaker. And as far as ghost hunters, or so-called ghost hunters, go, he is by far one of the most skeptical ghost hunters that I run into. However, he's coming at it from a standpoint where he really wants to believe in ghosts. And so, while he's like giving advice on this is how not to do ghost hunting because you'll fool yourself, he ended up in his own presentation making exactly the mistakes eventually that he warned other people not to make.
Yeah.
So I had a conversation with him about this, and what this led to is it led to him interviewing me on his radio show a few years back, and it was a wonderful interview. He was very, very nice. It was a very cordial discussion. You know, we didn't agree at all, but we had a very good rapport and a very, very meaningful discussion back and forth. And I basically told him, I said, well, look, if you really do want to proceed this sort of investigation of ghosts and this kind of paranormal phenomena ahead, and you really want the scientific community to engage, you have to play by the rules of science. And so I outlined for him questions that he and the ghost hunting community would have to address. And I said, first, you have to define what is a ghost, what's the operational definition of a ghost. Second, you have to come up with a mechanism by which ghosts could be detected. And third, you have to come up with a protocol that would give you a way of distinguishing a true ghost signal from something else that's going to set off your meter or whatever. And you have to sort of standardize this and agree. And I said, if you can do those things, then you're taking the steps that you need to take towards doing actual science instead of pseudoscience. And so rather than dismissing his claims outright, I was basically, I was trying to help him out, basically. And you know what? He actually admitted to me that that's what the ghost hunting community needs to do. He admitted it on his own show in the interview. He said, yes, you're right. That's exactly what we need to do. That's not what we're doing. And I was very pleasantly surprised. It was a very good experience for me. And I think having more interaction like that between skeptics and believers on various topics is probably about the only way you're going to progress this kind of discussion forward. So that's just kind of my 2 cents on the matter.
James, did you want to say something?
No, I agree with that completely. And neither side moves forward, by bashing or trying to make fun of each other. So, I like the idea of having those types of discussions. And the only problem, sometimes you get people who are so ignorant of scientific methods and what those safeguards Matt was talking about are and all that stuff. They're so far afield from that type of thinking that they're just of the I know what I saw opinion, and there's no prying them out of their belief.
Yeah. Let me ask before I end this segment. Do you guys ever look at like YouTube channels of people who claim to have paranormal videos or anything? Are you familiar with any of that? Or
I've seen a few, but I don't regularly follow any.
Because when you were mentioning, Matt, about this fellow and his ghost hunters, I was thinking there's a Bigfoot channel I came across, and there's a lot of Bigfoot channels. There are a few debunking channels. It's probably 90% or more pro Bigfoot. And there's this guy called Thinker Thunker. Apparently, he's a filmmaker in Arizona or somewhere in the Southwest, and he does what I would call sort of pseudo investigations. And he'll look at films, and every film he'll try to find an outline, for example, of a Bigfoot in a tangle of woods. But probably the most outrageous thing was I don't know if you guys have ever driven trucks or vans or cars professionally. I haven't. In the last decade or so, you have that backup feature where you can sometimes see the lines so that you can park without looking behind your head. And there was this one video of supposedly a couple, I think it might have been in British Columbia, in Canada, or somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, that supposedly ran over a Bigfoot. And so there's a video online of them backing up, and the woman is taking a cell phone video of the back camera from the car, and so they're backing up, and you can see clearly, the outline of the car, the 2 lines that define the width of the car, and then there's a line in the center. And your typical car is about maybe 6 feet wide, 7 feet wide maybe, and they're backing up, and then you see this hairy biped seemingly rise and come to chase after the car, and they pull away and whatnot. And this fellow Thinker Thunker does this supposed analysis where you can clearly see that the lines in the video would be about 6 or 7 feet if that's the width of the car. And so the being running towards you is clearly someone probably around 6 feet tall. And yet he makes this pseudoscientific claim that the line that is imposed by the computer camera is an actual dividing line of a road, and therefore the road has to be about 9 feet across on either side. So this has to be a giant. And then he superimposes a photograph of LeBron James, who's 6'8", and saying this creature is taller than LeBron James. And you look, and this guy will have 4,000 comments, 90% of them saying this is a great analysis. People aren't doing science, and yet I'm a layman, but I'm an intelligent layman, and you can see that this is just pseudoscientific bunk. So here again, we have someone. I can give the benefit of the doubt to the fellow who's the ghost hunter there, but here's a guy who's using scientific methods for willful obfuscation and to promote crap. Is it easier now in the 21st century, you think, to get away with that kind of thing, or not? Do you think that technology has made it easier or harder?
Well, I mean, it's easier to sound science-y and have more people not know that what people are saying is baloney, because science education in general in the country is in a horrible state.
Yeah.
So you could get on there and co-opt the language of science and make it sound like you're doing this in-depth analysis, and it could be a total load of crap. I mean, especially, and the internet is a double-edged sword with this, because anybody, its uncle can, fake a video. All videos and all photographs, Joe Nickel, one of our investigators said a long time ago, all photographs, all videos, all films should be considered works of fiction.
Yeah.
It's just not a reliable source for finding out about anything. There's one more thing I want to say about big feet, I don't know what the plural is. But, and this any zoologist will tell you too, there can't just be a couple of Bigfoots running around the Pacific Northwest, or 4 or 5 or something. In order to have a population that survives of any animal, especially a large mammal like that, presumably a mammal, you got to have, it's been discussed and agreed upon, there's got to be at least 40 or 50 or 60 or 100 of these things running around to keep the genetic component of their species alive and healthy. And if there's 50 or 60 of these things running around, why have we not found a single body yet? There's bodies of deer and elk and all sorts of different animals that people come across all the time. If this thing's out there and is intersecting with civilization as much as all the Bigfoot hunters say it is, with all their films and everything else, why hasn't a semi hit one yet? And we can just bring it to a lab and check it out. It hasn't happened yet because they don't exist.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's end this segment. In the next segment, I want to talk about some other big areas of unexplained phenomena, from UFOs to ghosts and stuff. And we'll do that in a moment. I'm speaking with Matthew Lowry and James Underdown, two people who are interested in research claims of unexplained phenomena of all sorts. Before I get into some of more classic examples of stuff, let me just ask you both if you could give an instance or two, perhaps, of when you came upon something that came tantalizingly close to that you might have said, man, that almost got me. I almost believed that. So let me ask James, what is the closest that someone has maybe come with proof of anything, whether it's a piece of a UFO or the ability to predict, the stock market the next day?
The short answer is nobody. We've been testing people for 16 years, and nobody has come close. The closest we had actually was one of the claimants did not show up for a test, and everyone was there, and we had the whole thing designed and ready to go. So we figured we would just do a practice run just to give our people a little bit of experience in running a test. And so we were using these things called the Zener cards, or the cards that have a plus, a circle, wavy lines, and psychics, alleged psychics, I always use the word alleged psychics, are supposed to guess which card it is. So there are 5 different cards, and you have a 1 out of 5 chance every guess if you keep shuffling the deck. And one of our people got, I think, the first 3 out of 5 right. Now, to get 3 in a row of these is 1 out of 5 times 1 out of 5 times 1 out of 5. It's 1 out of 125 to get 3 in a row like that. But he did, and we started looking around like, all right, what's going on? Who's cheating? What, somebody's in on a trick here. But it just turned out that he was just lucky. I mean, he missed the next 11 or 12 in a row, which evened out the statistics to what he should be getting. But it was kind of interesting that every once in a while, someone just gets really lucky and something just weird just happens.
Matt, was there any time you came across someone or something, some piece of evidence that made you go, this could be interesting, this may pan out?
Well, I'll actually share a personal story where I kind of, for a time, I actually kind of convinced myself that I'd had some sort of psychic experience. When I was a kid, I was in junior high when the Spatial Challenger accident took place, and the Challenger space shuttle exploded. That was in 1986. And I had convinced myself that I had some sort of psychic premonition where I dreamed about it like a night or two before. And so for a while, when I was a kid, I was kind of going around telling people, oh yeah, I dreamt about this before, so I had some sort of psychic vision about it. And it wasn't until later when I started learning more about, human memory and how we conflate things and mix things up and the timeline and all this sort of stuff, that I realized that what had likely happened is I likely had a nightmare about it after it had happened, and then I kind of somehow conflated this to having a psychic experience because I had misremembered that I actually had the dream or the nightmare after the event as opposed to before the event. And I think, if you're dealing with something that's kind of traumatic, because for me that was kind of a traumatic experience, as it was for a lot of people, I think it's really easy for us to, you don't necessarily have to have somebody who's like arguing a case who comes to you and says, here, this is what's going on. You can do it easily to yourself because that's exactly what I did. I did that to myself. And if I had, if I didn't have a circle of friends that were into that sort of stuff at the time, but if I thought that something like that had happened, and if I had people around me who had sort of that as their belief system, and that's sort of the way they approach things, then I could definitely see how I could have gotten really wrapped up into this stuff and sort of gone down a different path in terms of how I look at these sort of claims.
Yeah, the easiest explanation, the old Occam's razor, that the best explanation that fits the known facts is usually the correct one. So I want to go backwards to sort of my youth, and I want to give you 2 examples of experiences that I had and how I have figured out what they were. Now, I was born in 1965. When I was 6 years old, my parents used to take me and my sister. We'd go up to New Hampshire. And I remember when I was about 6, I drowned in a lake in New Hampshire. And I remember thinking, seeing my body floating and looking like as if I was below my body, looking up towards the sun shimmering through the water. And then I had this sort of, I guess, dream of somehow getting to the shore, no sound being heard, and meeting these sort of 2 kind of children that for me looked sort of feline in that they had kind of eyes and they were sort of greenish tinged. And about a decade later, when I was in high school, I first read about this myth called the Green Kids that came from another dimension. And I remember thinking when I read that, well, that seems very similar to the experience that I had. But what I've thought is that, there's the idea, it's controversial, of sort of people having sort of collective memories, the collective unconscious of Jung, racial memory, this kind of thing. And I've always thought that I probably had a trigger kind of experience that may have been something that other people have had. And it's interesting because when I first read about these green kids, and now it's called the Green Children of Woolpit. Supposedly, I think it's somewhere in Wales. I think it's set in Wales now, of some children that came from another dimension. The brother and sister, they didn't speak the language. And then the boy died. The girl lived maybe a decade on. They lost the color of their skin. And they spoke of a world of twilight shadows and whatnot. And yet, I remember when I first read about it for the first time in one of these old paperbacks from, I guess, the 70s is when I bought a used book. It was set, I think, in Spain. And then I saw another version of the tale in another book. It was set in France. And now in the internet era, it's sort of been set in, I guess, Woolpit. And I think it's, let me just click on the link here. I guess this is in East Anglia. So it's now been sort of cemented into Britain. And I've always been fascinated by the idea of how this has changed from the country of origin. And I remember reading in similar books, and I don't know if you read a lot of those books from the 70s or 80s. This was the age of Leonard Nimoy in Search Of. There was another story that was repeated in a lot of these books about a guy named David Gray in the 19th century. And David Gray supposedly disappeared in front of people. He was supposedly pulled out into another dimension or something. I think I read this in a book by a woman called Addie Kent Jeffries, or Jeffrey, something like that, who apparently wrote a lot about these myths and whatnot. But people, when they did research, found that there was never a David Gray in this, I guess it was some county of Indiana. And it was one of these stories from the 19th century yellow journalism that was just a legend retold and retold, and it gets slightly morphed. And so before the internet, it seemed that these stories did go through these iterations and sort of morphed slowly. Do you think that the internet has sped that up, in the way that these things catch wildfire, going back to the Slender Man story that I mentioned?
Well, yeah, now you don't need a newspaper to write it up. Anyone who has an internet connection can write it up. And,
like me.
Yeah, exactly. Fortunately, there are the Matts of the world who are, a little more reliable. But I mean, I've had people. I said, I would ask them, why do you believe this? And someone actually said, well, I read it on the internet. And I was like, do you have any idea how easy it is just to put anything on the internet? That is not the internet is not a reliable source of information, and it's a massively prolific source of information. So, it's these stories have the potential, at least, if it resonates with the imagination of the fellow surfers, that that they just go crazy. Viral videos and stories can go all the way around the world in seconds if people think it's an interesting story.
Yeah, there used to be an old saying that said something like a lie could make its way around the world before the truth can get its pants on in the morning.
That's right. Twain.
Right, and with the internet, I think you could amend that to say, a lie could make it to Mars before the truth could get its pants on or tie its shoes in the morning. But I agree with something that James said earlier about the internet kind of being a double-edged sword. One of the great things about the internet is it's helped to sort of democratize knowledge and so on and so forth, and that's a wonderful thing, especially when you're dealing with oppressive governments that are trying to keep people ignorant and so on and so forth. It's great for breaking down those kinds of walls, but the other side of it is it's democratized knowledge because there are people who, like you say, they say, well, I read it on the internet, and so what they don't do is they kind of see that because they have the internet connection, just like the scientists or the scholars have the internet connection, that somehow maybe give them an equal level of knowledge or expertise as these so-called experts and so on and so forth. And I think that can kind of feed into this mentality that, well, I have my lab, for example, and then, somebody else who's unsaved, they believe in that UFOs are aliens or that they have second powers. So, well, because I have my lab, that gives me just as much validity as you. And so, you see this on social media all the time, for example. This reminds me of the time, back, I think it was 2011 when the BP oil disaster happened in the Gulf, and they had that horrendous leak on the ocean floor. Yeah. This oil just kept pouring out, and at the time, there was this real attack against the government and President Obama because they said, "Oh, he's just not plugging the hole for whatever reason." And as a physics professor, I sat there and actually looked at the calculations, and I'm like, yeah, there's a reason why they're not plugging the hole. I mean, these pressures are enormous, the conditions are horrendous, and it's an engineering nightmare. It's going to take them a long time to figure this out. And I would try to explain to people on social media, Facebook at the time, that it would be like trying to plug a fire hose. My wife came up with this analogy, by the way, not me, but she said it's like trying to plug a fire hose turned on full blast with your finger. Mm. And there were people who simply refused to, even entertain this thought because they're so wrapped up in this idea that there's got to be this conspiracy between the oil companies and the government to screw the Gulf Coast or whatever, that, even if you show them the hard numbers, no, it just was completely irrelevant. Because they saw the stuff on the internet, and as you sit there at some point and you're like, your head explodes because I don't know how you get around that. So yeah, just what James said, it's a double-edged sword.
Well, let me give another example. I'd earlier talked about alien abductions versus Satanism versus angels supposedly, and there's the same thing that people. These strange beings immobilize someone at night or something. They do some kind of looking down at someone. There's actually a famous film by Carl Theodor Dreyer called Vampire, where there's a scene of a guy, he has a dream of being in a coffin, being carried away, and the people are looking into his coffin. And you get this idea that's a very powerful image, and it was a film that was widely praised in Europe back in the 1930s. But I grew up in a very Goodfellas-like environment with a lot of gangsters and a lot of scumbags and crooked cops and crooked politicians and whatnot. And when in the mid-'70s, I remember we didn't have air conditioning, and I would wake up in the middle of the night sometimes. And I remember having a few what I would call dreams of these kind of beings that wore sort of these almost like capes, and they had these sort of fedoras, and they had these sort of red eyes, and it was a similar kind of thing of them looking down on me and kind of probe me. And I was telling this to a younger person that I was talking to, and he said, well, it's interesting because I'm a writer and I'm creative, that I had what was a very archetypal kind of experience, but my own spin was on it. These creatures were almost certainly id-like projections of these gangsters that I grew up in the neighborhood with, because they had the fedoras, they had that kind of sinister feel to them. To what degree do you? I mean, have you ever studied, for example, the differences in culture, in time, and how some of these things morph? For example, like. If you're talking about something like Bigfoot, or whether it's the Yeti or Bigfoot or other hairy bipeds or lake monsters, does each country of origin, does each sort of time, say the mid-20th century versus now, what is the reflection of the place and the times upon these myths or these things that people believe in?
Yeah, there's a definite correlation between culture and expectations and the experiences people have. We see this in the near-death experience.
Jesus or Buddha. It's seeing Jesus or Buddha.
Right. Right. You're not. Yeah. The someone who has a near-death experience in Mongolia does not visit God and Jesus.
Yeah.
And by the way, I mean, what you mentioned before about, having certain types of dreams, there's a whole, first of all, anything that happens while you're sleeping, as far as I'm concerned, is automatically suspect.
Yeah.
There are huge categories of experiences people have when they're on their way into going to sleep, called hypnagogic experiences and hypnopompic experiences, where they're coming out of sleep. So you're in this twilight between a dream state and being conscious, and there are aspects of both contributing to what you're experiencing, and it does feel very real. I had one time I woke up quickly thinking that someone was grabbing my calf, and woke up and looked around the room, and the door was locked and the windows were locked, and there was no one there. But I can attest to how real some of these things feel. But it was because I was somewhere in this twilight zone, and there are a whole other category, other experiences like sleep paralysis causes a whole set of experiences where something or someone is sitting on your chest, or there's a sinister figure just like you had that's at the end of the bed. We did an
incubi and succubi.
Yeah, exactly, incubus. So people have these experiences all the time, and they feel like they can't move, and they panic, and they're seeing things. These are all natural things that happen to lots of different human beings, but they're in no way connected to some other world or some other dimension. They're just things that people experience.
Yeah, I think the whole point about the cultural specificity of how people interpret things is a very good point. For example, you kind of alluded to it, Dan, when you were asking your question earlier, that if you were talking about certain things that people observed or certain things that people experienced, they would interpret that as a religious experience, say, if you're talking a few hundred years ago or even 50 years ago or something. But, in the 20th century in Western civilization especially, science and technology has really come to the forefront. And so you start to see the evolution of these previously sort of religious experiences that were interpreted as the work of angels as kind of morphing into, it's not angels, they're now aliens. And I think a perfect example of this kind of thinking is you have of course, when you talk about creationism, and this is sort of my pet pseudoscientific topic that I do a lot of research on because I'm a public school teacher. When you talk about creationism, we have to bear in mind that there's many varieties of creationism, and the most common one in the United States, at least, is what's called young Earth creationism.
Yeah.
It's of course very religiously fundamentalist in terms of the Christian belief system and so on. But in a few decades ago, there was this new kind of creationism that a lot of people don't know is creationism. It's called Raelianism.
Yeah.
And this kind of dovetailed with sort of the cultural phenomenon of the New Age movement, but it's also atheistic in the sense that it has nothing to do with God or angels or religion. It's a purely kind of, I guess you might say, secular form of creationism in the sense that it's not angels or God, it's aliens. And it's creationism for exactly the same reasons that the religious variations of creationism are, but it's coming at it from a different cultural perspective, and they're getting the same things wrong. They're just getting them wrong for these different cultural reasons. And so it's really interesting, say, to confront a young Earth creationist and say, oh, well, so you agree with the aliens? And they're like, what? No, of course not. They're atheists. Well, no, but you're believing in creationism just like they are. That's always a very interesting conversation to have because there's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance there because they can't see that the aliens are creationists just like they are.
Well, it goes to the old saying that everyone's an atheist. It's the only thing that people call themselves atheists just have one less God than every other kind of atheist. Um,
Yeah,
let
yeah.
me put something out there, and this gets back to my youth. I want to talk about UFOs for a moment, or aliens, extraterrestrials, and I want to get away from the abduction thing. Most of the conspiracy kind of theorists get around to things like the Roswell crash, supposedly, certain other events around the world, Area 51 here in, I guess it's Nevada, Groom Lake, whatever else it's been known as. And the thing that uh, I get, I can believe that there's a conspiracy, but I don't think that there's a conspiracy in the way that the believers believe it in. Now, I mentioned that I had grown up in a very mobbed up neighborhood, and I remember when I was a kid, I was one of the few white kids in a Hispanic, and actually the only one. And I remember a friend of mine had gone sometimes to visit his uncle, who was in Rikers Island once, and also in the Queens County Jail. And both times, I remember my friend and I were picked up by these guys in a big black sedan, government agents, and they weren't after me, but I remember having to sit in a room waiting for 6 or 7 hours while my friend was being grilled. And so I know that there are people, agents of the government or what you will, who will do things. They will not observe the Constitution. People sometimes think that between the death of, say, J. Edgar Hoover and 9/11, there was a 30-year paradise where the rights of the citizens were respected. And I say, no, I can attest to that. So I'm wondering if the idea of that we have alien bodies or wreckage, which I don't believe, because we'd have much greater technology now. We wouldn't be worrying about a lot of the Islamic terrorists if we had alien technology. But would you say that there could be a conspiracy in that the government is putting out willful disinformation to send a lot of these people off on these wild goose chases, so that real technology that is being developed at these bases, for example, of whatever it might be, uh, gets sort of the cover that people say, oh, there they go again, thinking about this, that, or the other thing. So there could be a conspiracy in the sense that the government is planting willful disinformation for the gullible. Do you either of you think that that's the more likely thing, or is it just total bunkum, do you think?
I mean, I don't, the government is working on secret weapons and planes and things all the time. So that the fact that there are secret areas somewhere in the United States where they're working on things that a regular citizen is not allowed to see, I expect that to be a fact. I mean, it's not a secret weapon or a new threatening weapon in our military arsenal if everybody knows about it. And
Yeah.
at some point, they had someone flew the first stealth bomber plane, and somebody driving in their car saw it. So there's just enough actual secrecy going on in the government, some of it legitimate, to then fuel all these other ideas that we're hiding bodies and all these other extraordinary claims. I mean, listen, I just can't imagine that lots of people in the United States could be hiding the most extraordinary find in the history of all humanity, and now that could not leak out. When you look at some of the other leaks that have happened, I'll mention Nixon and Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
If that stuff could get out inside, what should be the most private circumstances, how are you going to keep a dead alien body a secret? I just don't buy it.
Yeah, I think Jim's point about sort of just was a very good one in the sense that when you talk about conspiracy theories, whatever their flavor, the reason why I think a lot of people believe conspiracy theories, one form or the other, is because there's a kernel of truth to the claim that there are conspiracies. And we know that there have been conspiracies and cover-ups by the government. I mean, if you talk about Roswell and so on and so forth, well, when did that take place? So it's like 1947, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
Well, that's just on the heels of World War II, where the United States government had one of the most secretive and their programs ever, the Manhattan Project. And yeah, of course they covered it up. Of course there was a conspiracy to keep that secret because we were trying to win World War II. We were developing the atomic bomb, and there were all these crazy things going on in the desert with this weird technology and all this sort of stuff. And then of course it comes out that, oh my gosh, this is what they were doing in the desert this whole time. Well, all right. So is it any wonder that, you know, a few years later people are spinning these yarns about other kinds of conspiracies, this time connected to aliens, and they center on secret military facilities in the desert? Well, no, of course not, because there's a grain of truth already there. And so if there's a grain of truth to the idea that the U.S. government can have cover-ups and conspiracies, then, you know, it's no wonder that people will tend to go down that road when you make these other claims.
There's
Roswell itself was a secret military project. They were sending up listening devices on long balloon trains, and the listening devices were designed to pick up the same kind of low-level sound vibrations that were caused by nuclear blasts. So, you know, they're working on this thing so we could spy on the Russians or whoever and try to monitor their level of development with nuclear bombs. And so, you know, one of these test runs blows off course and they lose the thing, and some guy outside of Roswell picks up the debris and bring it into town. By the way, he waited a few days. You know, in the most extraordinary find in human history, he waited several days to go into town for some other stuff. So that tells you how excited he was about it in the first place. And did the government come in and grab the stuff and try to keep it a secret? Of course, it was a secret project. So secret projects may themselves spawn all these other further speculation and conspiracy theories.
Yeah,
I think a good point to note here is when you're talking about these kinds of conspiracy theories, it goes back to the original point I made way back in the beginning of the interview, where unfortunately, pretty much all conspiracy theories suffer from the same flaw, and they're essentially arguments of ignorance. You know, in the case of Roswell, it's like, oh well, they're up to something in that base over there in the desert. Well, what is it they're up to? Well, I don't know what they're up to because I don't have any evidence, but I think it's aliens. Well, wait a minute. You know, if it's covered up and it's a secret and you don't know what the cover up is, how do you know what it is? And that's the fundamental flaw in this kind of thinking. But you know, we're not always rational beings, so there you go.
There's a perceptual phenomenon called pareidolia, which is basically the human desire to see mostly human-like visages, but also familiar things. The most famous one in this context would probably be the face on Mars 40-some years ago, and I forget the name of the fellow who most propagated it. But that was obviously rather easily debunked. But there seems to be not only that desire, to look and see human kind of faces, but getting back to the will to believe, even in things that aren't really paranormal, you get some really crazy claims. Let me give you two examples of supposed time travel, and you've probably heard of this. A couple of years ago, there was a discovery of a clip from a Charlie Chaplin promotional film for one of his films, and it went on called Chaplin's Time Traveler, wherein you see a zebra, I believe, and then you see an old woman coming out of the theater, and it looks like she's talking into something, and they think it's a cell phone. And then the other most famous one is this photograph, which is a genuine photograph, unretouched, where it's at the opening of a bridge in, I think, British Columbia in 1941, and you see people in typical early 40s outfits at the thing, and there's one fellow who seemingly has a small camera. He looks like he has a more modern haircut. He has what looks to be a Montreal Maroons T-shirt on. This was a former National Hockey League franchise, and people say, well, he's dressed differently, and he's got a small camera, so it must be a digital camera. So he must have come back and traveled through time. And in both instances, with just a little research, a number of people online have shown that the woman has probably had a hearing device, and in the film it looks like she's talking into it, so it must be a cell phone. But she could have been schizophrenic, or she might have been singing a song to herself. And the other one is just a guy who looks a little bit different. And in both cases, people say this is proof of time travel. So here you have something that two totally innocent things. No, there's no monsters lurking in the background, but just people slightly different. One guy's dressed a little different. One woman is holding something to her ear that looks vaguely like a 21st century object. And here we get reams of websites asking, is this proof? Is that proof? If you would speak to maybe the idea of pareidolia, the will to see into things, and how these very innocent things, when no one previously had ever made any claims, suddenly become, in the minds of some, proof of extrasensory, or not extra, but time travel or other silliness.
Yeah, it's well known that we are pattern-seeking creatures. We see faces everywhere. We try to pareidolia there's another thing called apophenia, where you're trying to attach significance and seeing and connecting the dots between things that may not actually have a connection. That's probably an inherent aspect that human beings share. It probably helped us through our evolution to see even if we're seeing faces or figures or animals or danger, even if it's not there, it's better to be assume that the danger is there and blow out of there than to not see it in the first place and get caught off guard. So the fact that our brains work this way may have served us well in evolutionary terms, but now we that aspect of how our brains work see all kinds of things everywhere. I mean, there's the faces of Jesus and the Madonna and cheese sandwiches and tortillas and everything. It's just everywhere, and it's just a matter of how much significance you want to attach to it. If you realize that if you walk through life and if you ever actually leave the house, and you're going to see zillions and zillions of things over the course of your life, and every once in a while something's going to look like a face or what people think Jesus looked like or whatever. In fact, there was a Matt probably remembers this, but there was an overpass in Chicago over Fulton Avenue where people made this big shrine because they saw this Madonna stain in the concrete underneath the expressway there. And I went there and took a bunch of pictures, and I saw Bart Simpson, I saw jellyfish, I saw a devil, I saw a huckleberry hound, I saw all kinds of things, and nobody built shrines to any of these things. But all those images were in the same overpass. And just people didn't strike them as severely.
Yeah, I think it's also a good point to note that when you're talking about phenomena like pareidolia specifically, they're very context and culturally specific. I actually do a little demonstration of this in my physics classes. When we talk about light, I do a day or two on optical illusions and so on, because it's just kind of fun, but it also gets the kids thinking a little more skeptically about stuff. And I show them a slideshow of pareidolia. And, we go through all these examples, and then we get to the Virgin Mary grilled cheese sandwich that James alluded to. And I just asked him, I said, what do you see? And almost every kid recognizes a face. A lot of kids say, oh, it's the Mona Lisa. A few kids say it's Jesus. A few kids say it's the Virgin Mary. A lot of kids say it's Marilyn Monroe, and so on and so forth. And then I actually pulled one of my classes one time because I had a lot of kids in one particular class that said, oh, this is the Virgin Mary. And I said, okay, let me ask you a question. Of those of you who said it's the Virgin Mary, how many of you are Catholic? And almost every single one raised their hand. It was really very interesting. And then what I do is I follow up that image of the Virgin Mary grilled cheese sandwich with another image, and this is really telling. And it's a picture of a piece of fruit that has been cut in two, and the halves have been separated, and the innards are on display. And I say, what do you see? And not one single student has ever said they see anything. They say, well, I just see a piece of fruit and a bunch of seeds. And then I ask them, okay, how many of you can read Arabic? And they all kind of look at each other, and they're like, none of us can. Why? And I say, well, the story behind this is that this is a piece of fruit that was cut open in a market in the Middle East. And the gentleman who cut this open looked at the seeds and claimed that in the seeds he saw the name of Allah written in Arabic. And this piece of fruit became a religious icon. But you wouldn't know that unless you grew up in that context, unless you were probably Muslim, and unless you read Arabic. And some of the kids start to chuckle, and then I say, oh, really? And then I flip back to the Virgin Mary grilled cheese sandwich, and then they're like, oh. I say, you see this because you have this cultural context. But I show you the next picture, and it means absolutely nothing to you because you don't have that context. You have absolutely no capability to even see that. And then they really start to understand the whole point of pareidolia, that it's not just the pattern recognition side of things. It's also, what is the cultural context? Can you even have the capability of recognizing this thing? And quite frankly, it looks different to different people. That's the whole point, because we come at things from a different direction. So it's a fun demonstration that I love to do whenever I have the chance in my classes. And a lot of kids walk away from it, they're like, wow, that was really cool. And, and it gets them thinking about it. That's kind of the point.
Yeah.
Just get them at least thinking about it.
And it's also sort of another thing, there's also statistical kind of cherry picking that goes on in these things. And probably the best example I can think of is what was big in the 70s, the Bermuda Triangle, where, in the supposed however a million square miles, there's always going to be X amount of ships or airplanes that go down without explanation. There was the one in the Indian Ocean just last year, the 370 or whatever it was. And that has conspiracy theories naturally, as well as the plane that was shot down over the Ukraine or whatnot. But if you just look and said, wow, whatever it was, 150 vessels have disappeared in the last 100 years in that Bermuda Triangle. Wow, there must be something there. Until you recognize, well, that if you open it up to the whole Atlantic, there's no statistical difference between that and, say, the Middle Passage between Brazil and West Africa. The same general percentages are going to apply all the way around.
Imagine that. Ocean travel is sometimes dangerous, especially where it's stormy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, you had mentioned
not even just ocean. There's an area in Wisconsin, Chicagoans know it. That's that little finger that sticks out in Lake Michigan. It's called Door County. And north of Door County is full of wrecks. I've scuba dived near some of the wrecks. And they're any area that gets bad weather every now and then that is highly trafficked is going to lose ships.
Yeah, well, Lake Superior, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the old song there. I mean, they've been having mining ships go down there for a couple of centuries. You'd mentioned too that your physics, and I wanted to bring up a famous photo involving water, and that's the old Loch Ness Surgeons photo. And one of the famous things in Hollywood that if you look at like old films with model ships, whether it's World War II or Moby Dick or whatnot, water doesn't scale. And when you look at, for
Right.
example, that surgeon's photo, it's obvious from the waves there that this thing is maybe only 3 or 4 inches high, the little thing sticking up there. And I remember even as a child, the first time I said that, I said, that's fake. I said, because even though I didn't know that water couldn't see it, I said, well, I know the difference when I see a real photo of the ocean versus water with the, and yet there's a perfect example of just knowing basic physics, and it's so obviously phony.
Yeah, I'm so happy you mentioned that, because the moment you started talking about this, my mind went to the old Godzilla movies that I would see.
Yeah.
Where the dudes in the rubber suit jumping around, smashing up the small scale version of Tokyo. Because when I was a kid seeing that, invariably there's at some point where he has to cross a river or something, and you can just immediately tell. It's like, that's obviously not real, because that's not the way water really ripples. And so for people who point to that picture or those films and they say, see, this is evidence for the Loch Ness monster, I almost just feel like showing them one of these old Godzilla movies and saying, okay, is that real? Because it's got exactly the same flaws in that picture or in that video that the one you're showing me does. Yeah, that's kind of funny. I'm glad you brought that up. That is a great physics thing. Yeah. Water doesn't scale, but you can just see how the waves move. It's like, on that size scale, the waves should be moving so much slower because of so much more mass, but they don't.
Yeah. I want to just touch on a couple more things and then end this segment, and then we'll do a final segment to end the interview. I wanted to just talk about extrasensory perception for a moment, and James probably has more experience with this, so I'll start with him. It would seem a very simple task to prove extrasensory perception. I think back like UFOs in the early quote-unquote contactee era, people who claim to have gone to Venus, for example, and whatnot. And then obviously they were debunked when we found out in the early or mid-60s that Venus was a hothouse, cell house. And recently with the Pluto flyby that we had recently, it would seem to me that if I could project myself out into the cosmos, as lots of people claim, it's very easy to say, well, you should find, say, a heart-shaped mountain range on Pluto, or this, that, or they should have known, someone who was going through the solar system should have known that Uranus and Neptune had rings, even though we couldn't see them the way we could on Saturn. We should know, for example, someone should be able to project themselves and say, oh, well, this is where Genghis Khan's tomb was. So if it's so easy to test, why does anyone even, it would seem to me that's more than anything else, than any other unexplained phenomena, that's the easiest to debunk. Do you find that there, James, that there are a higher percentage of people who claim that than, say, are Bigfoot followers? I mean, I guess I'm asking, where do you find the most people congregated? Is it in ghost hunting? Is it in this ESP stuff? Or?
Yeah, probably the most common claim we've tested is telepathy. We've had a few dowsers too, but telepathy, not so much remote viewing. I mean, listen, all these claims are easy to test. We went to you talk about remote viewing, you don't have to go to Saturn. You could go out in the parking lot.
Yeah.
We went to a remote viewing class one time, and I put a giant 4-digit number on top of my car before I went into the class, and said at the end of the class, I said, I got a check right here. Our prize was $5,000 at the time. I'll give anyone in this room a $5,000 check if you could tell me, project yourself out into the parking lot outside and tell me what the 4-digit number is on the top of my car. And they got angry. And I was like, why are you angry? You're in here teaching this ability to other people. You believe that it exists. You believe that it could be cultivated. Why don't you just do it and take my money? Well, they didn't have an answer for that. But we do, a lot of the tests we've done has been telepathy, where one person is sending thoughts to another person. And I love that test. I mean, all you need is a deck of cards, or 20 words written on 3x5 note cards, and you just separate people and just make sure that there's no other way for them to communicate with each other. And they do abominably. They can't. A lot of times they don't even get a single word or number correct. So it's I don't know if it's just people. I mean, I know people have experiences where they think they're doing this mental communication all the time. You know, they'll be on the phone with each other and they'll say, you know, one will say to the other, I'm thinking about going to the movie tonight. And another guy will say, I knew you were going to say that. I was just thinking about going to see a movie tonight myself. And they're just remembering those, you know, rare examples, and they forget about the other 1,000 things that they said that didn't match up. So that's people they don't come in trying to fool us. 100% of them so far have actually been completely sincere in their belief that they had these abilities. But when they get there and we, you know, adjust for all of these other conditions, they can't do it all the time. They can't do it.
Yeah, the way I like to respond very briefly to the whole telepathy claim is to say, well, you know, if telepathy were the real thing, then we wouldn't have any need of needs.
Yeah.
and that's kind of a snarky way of tackling it, but you know, it actually makes a very good point, because if people really did have this telepathic capability and so on and so forth, I mean, you would think that, you know, this kind of ties in the government conspiracy angle of it too. You would think that, you know, like the CIA or something would have rooms full of literal mind readers, right? Literal people who could, you know, can read thoughts from across the planet, you know, the Professor X lab or something, and that our country would never be blindsided by things like 9/11, for example, because hey, you know, we have these expert telepathists who can, you know, read the enemy's minds, and we would never have issues like that. But then things like that happen, so it's like, well, okay, so much for that idea. Yeah, you know, just in the sense of not even talking about the actual testing side of things, like what James is talking about. It just seems to me that the whole concept of telepathy kind of breaks down just by analyzing it in terms of those kinds of logical arguments.
Well, let me end this segment, and I have to talk about video and photographic manipulation with newer Photoshop and other things that I'm certain are in the pipeline. In the next 15 or 20 years, we're going to see a lot more of that. I want to talk about one photo that's almost ubiquitous online, and then also talk about video. Well, let me just talk about the video first, and then I'll get to the photo. I don't know if either of you have ever heard of this YouTube channel. James, you may want to recruit this guy into your organization. His name is Captain Disillusion, a guy named Alan Melejanian. And he does really brilliant videos. They're entertaining, but more so than that, he has a knowledge about how old-time videotapes. He can look at a video. There's a famous supposed ghost walking across Disneyland that he shows without a doubt is just a guard from an earlier tape that wasn't fully erased and is walking across. And he is really terrific in dissecting this. And also giving cultural background. For example, there's a famous video of supposedly a girl in Russia being taught to fly or whatnot. And he goes into the background of Russia's obsession with flying children in the 60s and 70s during the communist era. But I wanted to talk about, and this is getting back to where I started with the Slender Man kind of thing. There's a famous photo called the Cooper family photo. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a black and white photo that came up in the mid-'00s. And apparently the story goes that a family named the Coopers moved into their home in the late 50s. There's a grandma, a mother, and two young boys. And on the left side of them, where it looks like they're celebrating a party or something, there looks to be a body that's falling from the top. and the claim is that a body fell in the middle of the photo. But yet, even as someone who's a layman, you can see the light is totally off and whatnot. And there's a guy who runs a website called Debunking, who I was trying to get onto this show, who did a brilliant job. He runs this forum, Debunk, and one of the young boys in the photo actually wrote in, and he apparently gave proof that it wasn't the Cooper family, but he's part of the Copper family. And there's photos that show that he is the boy. And apparently, someone just about a decade ago photoshopped this in. And like Slender Man, except for the fact that Slender Man, the guy took authorship and has never claimed that it was real. Here you have a photo that has been endlessly reproduced, and in all of these videos that say 20 photos that can't be explained, this inevitably shows up. Where do you think that video and photographic manipulation is going? And do you think that your job will get harder or easier in the next 10, 20, 25 years in disproving this stuff?
I think mine is somewhat getting easier because, every kid growing up now knows that Photoshop exists and that video editing techniques exist and CG exists. I mean, geez, I live in Hollywood. Everybody here wouldn't ever trust, I shouldn't say everybody, but I mean, people know that this stuff can be faked. And I think the more fakes that flood out there, the general concept that most people, especially as the technology progresses and younger people who were born into this technology understand this, as time goes on, people should be naturally getting more skeptical about anything that's shot on video or done in a photograph. They should just automatically know that it might be faked. And so I think I hope that is the case, and that will, there'll be a sort of a more natural knee-jerk skepticism in the future.
Matt?
Yeah, I think I kind of agree with James in a lot of ways. I do want to say that this whole discussion kind of reminds me of a very funny ex-KCD comic I saw years ago. I don't know if you guys know what ex-KCD is, but it's a great online webcomic. And it's a graph of time and the number of iPhone cameras available to the public, and it basically on the vertical axis it says evidence for Bigfoot,
Yeah.
and then time and the number of iPhones, and as the number of iPhones and cameras that are available to people have gone up, the evidence for Bigfoot has plummeted because you have all of this technology where everybody has one of these and they have a camera on them at all times, yet still nobody can come up with a decent picture or Bigfoot, the picture's always fuzzy or out of focus or this or that. And it's geez, you would think with all of this technology out there by now, somebody would have been able to produce some more solid evidence than the blurry, Patterson film and all that sort of business. Yeah, so in large part, I agree that as the technology progresses and as people become more comfortable with the technology, that they'll be able to see through fakes or be more skeptical of things. And I think that's kind of true of any kind of technology. I mean, when photography came on the scene, well over a century ago, back in the 19th century, there were people who were faking things, and there were probably a lot of people who felt more, basically because they just didn't understand how this stuff worked. They weren't familiar with it, and so it was easy to perpetrate hoaxes or tall tales like the Cottingley fairies and so on with that kind of technology. And now it's the same kind of thing. It's almost like an arms race, as the technology develops, there's a span of time when people aren't familiar with it, and so people can kind of be deceived by their ignorance of this technology. But then, people catch up and become more used to the technology, especially when it becomes, democratized like iPhones and similar things. And then, something new comes along, and then people get educated, and it just kind of, I think it just is kind of like an arms race like that. So I agree with James in the sense that with many things, people Photoshop and so on. People say, oh well, it's obviously photoshopped, or I'm not going to believe it unless I see it, or they'll be skeptical. But at the same time, I think when technology develops, we'll see it again. Like I'm waiting for holographic technology to come to full development. And I fully expect that when it does, which I think it will, hopefully within the next 10 years or so, but I fully expect that when holographic technology really comes into full bloom, that you'll see a bunch of people making wild claims and so on. But when it becomes more and more widespread, when more and more people become familiar with it, those claims will go away, just like the Cooper family photo.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more skeptical, I guess, than you guys, because I'll just give you a long ago example and a modern example that I think basically the same thing. In 1917 there was the Our Lady of Fatima incident in Portugal, where supposedly the Virgin Mary appeared, and some people say it was a UFO, or it was the sun shining or whatnot, and people saw angels or whatnot. And then I think of this more recent thing, the late 90s, the so-called Phoenix Lights, and you've seen some of these UFO things where supposedly a ship the size of fucking Phoenix is over the goddamn city. Everyone would be in a panic, yet I remember when I first saw this, I think it was on 2020 in the late 90s, about a month later, that was the first I'd heard of it. And over the years, I've seen other little things of people supposedly in their backyards. Well, this was taken during the Phoenix Lights thing. And it's like, well, I mean, if you had something like that, or that the fellow Bud Hopkins, a UFO researcher, talked about how the president or the former head of the United Nations had seen a woman abducted into one of the books he wrote about a woman being abducted by a UFO in the middle of or not in the middle of the night, but over Manhattan or whatnot. If these things were real, they'd be easily debunked, and yet people to this day will swear, I saw the Phoenix Light. It's like everyone who saw some famous sporting event. Babe Ruth pointed to the stands and said he was going to hit a home run in the 1933 World Series. There's only 15,000 people or whatnot that were there, but 1 million people claim to have been there. So I don't know. I guess I'm a little more skeptical about human nature, because I think people, just as you build a better mousetrap, the mice get smarter, and the mice are going to get more elaborate rationales as the technology improves. I don't know. That's my take on it. But anyway, let's. Go ahead.
That actually speaks to the larger picture, which is to teach people critical thinking skills in general, so that they're asking the right questions in the first place. So they don't even have to know the answer to all these, mysteries. There's always going to be mysteries and weird things that are happening. What we're trying to do is just to get people thinking in terms of what questions they should be asking, and developing a little level of skepticism where you're going to demand a level of proof that is going to lead you to a more likely answer than just somebody who's trying to sell a book or get you to visit their website or their TV show.
Yeah, let me give you a real quick example of what James is talking about. That I'll be very brief. One of the first sort of skeptical lessons I do in my physics classes is sort of on the tail end of our unit on projectile motion, and there's a video that went viral a few years ago on the internet. It was called it's the famous Mega Whoosh video, and it supposedly showed this guy on this big wet slip and slide that goes all the way down the mountainside, and he flies up this ramp, and then he flies across this valley by like 300 or 400 feet, and he lands in this little pool about barely the size of a wading pool. Splash, and he gets out, and everybody's like, "Yo, this is great!" And I show this to my students, and it was most effective when it first came out, because a lot of them were like, "Wow!" I said, "But do you see anything that's weird here?" And because they had just finished their unit on projectile motion, we actually, we didn't say anything about the digital technology or video. We just said, well, let's just apply a little bit of basic physics here. And then very quickly, my students have figured out this couldn't be real because based upon some very rough measurements and calculations, the guy would be traveling so quickly in the horizontal direction when he hit the water that he should have like blasted right through the side of that tub or broken his legs or something, and he just gets up like it's nothing, and they're like, yeah, there's no way that can be real. And then, of course, I revealed that it was a fake video and that they kind of figured it out. They're like, yeah. So James is right. You know, if you can teach people some of these basic critical thinking skills so that they ask the right questions, and they don't even need to necessarily even be familiar with the technology or know how it works to see through things.
Yeah. Well, you would really like this Captain Disillusion because he talks a lot about physics too. So check him out when you get a chance. Let's wrap this segment, and in our final segment, I'll just give you a few closing remarks, and we'll do that in a moment. I spent the last hour and a half or so speaking with James Underdown and Matt Lowry about unexplained phenomena, the human desire to see things, to believe things that defy explanation or actually have explanation, I should say, but they use their own illogic. So let me just give you both a couple of minutes to just sum up any of your thoughts. James, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, I would start by saying that almost all this stuff is explained. I see some of these old Leonard Nimoy shows, and I sit there and I start yelling at the TV. That's explained. That's explained. We know what happened here. So, I mean, the problem is, you know, most people don't have a physics background like Matt, or they don't read Skeptical Inquirer, or just learn about these things, or aren't even particularly skeptically inclined or have good critical thinking skills in the first place. But the fact of the matter is, the answers are out there. Almost all of these, virtually all of these claims, at least by category, maybe not specifically by a specific event or incident or something, but all these types of things and these types of claims have been explained ad nauseum to a high level of reliability. I could point you to good information about everything we've talked to on this show today. And if you really did the reading about it and really wanted to learn what the explanation was, if you went into it open-minded, you would not be a believer after reading this information. But the problem is, not that many people comparatively, Skeptical Inquirer has, 40 or 50,000 subscribers out of the whole world. So, most of the people in the world do not seek out this side of the explanations, or are, have done the sort of reading and background to find it out, or do the investigations themselves. A lot of this stuff, that's why I got into doing investigations, is because a lot of this stuff, you can just test it yourself. Next time you're at a dinner party and someone tells you, they can talk to the dead, or they could read minds, or they could douse for water, you can set up a test in 5 minutes for something like that, and put their feet to the fire and see if they can actually do it. So that's the message I would say, that if people continue to harbor these beliefs, and we all know that some of them are a lot of fun to think about, and they're mysterious and exciting and all that stuff. But if you really think they really happened, the information is out there to find out the truth behind it, or at least what is extremely likely to be the truth behind it.
Yeah, it's sort of like the Von Daniken level of credulity. I remember a few years ago when my wife and I first got Netflix, there was some show called like Incredible Monsters or something, and I watched about 20 or so episodes, and we're going after a giant squid, or we're going after Bigfoot, or we're going after Chupacabra, and they would set up cameras and all this elaborate stuff, and they would see, a cage that we hung 10 feet up on a tree could only have been gotten by a Bigfoot. Something came there, and then they look at the video. It was a raccoon that came across, and it's like, and every episode ended with total failure, but they were saying, well, we made real progress this time. We proved that this, and it's like, no, you didn't. You utterly, totally failed. There was no Bigfoot on the camera. Everything had a logical explanation, and yet every episode, we're getting closer to the truth. But anyway, Matt. Yeah.
Sorry, one quick last thing. I made a prediction a few years ago when the Bigfoot. I think there might even be 2 Bigfoot shows on right now. I said, what is going to happen if this thing actually lasts? What are they going to be doing on this show in 3 or 4 years from now when they still haven't found the actual? I will be amazed at the production team that somehow they will keep people tuning in when show after show after episode and season after season they are not finding it. It just amazes me.
And what amazes me is that they go on something like the History Channel or this what used to be the Discovery Channel. It's like this that should be for Jacques Cousteau. That should be for this should not be for Bigfoot hunters. It's like when I remember cable was doomed when I saw the History Channel and a decade or so, and they did the history of cement. But now that looks good because now they have the History Channel with a bunch of yokels going out to antique shops pouring through junk. So anyway, Matt, what's your final take?
Well, I'll just say that I think one of the important things to note is while we do understand that there's a lot of things that are explained, there's also a lot of things that we don't have explanations for. And since that's really kind of the thrust of the whole show, I just want to emphasize something I've mentioned a couple of times, that one of the reasons I think a lot of people fool themselves into believing certain things, it really boils down to the argument from ignorance.
Yeah.
Because, if you're admitting that something is not explained, then you really can't go any further with it in the sense of saying what it is, because you're admitting that you don't know what it is. And I think what a lot of people are afraid of is I think a lot of people are afraid of that kind of uncertainty. I think a lot of people are afraid to say, I don't know. And because they're afraid of that sort of uncertainty, or they're afraid of not knowing, they're afraid of this unknown, they try to fill in that gap in their ignorance with something that they find comforting. Angels or aliens or time travel or whatever. When the reality is, when you say, we don't know what it is, it really means you don't know what it is, and you simply have to suspend judgment. You just can't make any conclusions. You have to accept that there isn't an answer right now. Maybe if more evidence comes along and it's analyzed in a solid, skeptical, scientific manner, then maybe there will be an answer later, but maybe there won't. And I think that's a very important thing for people to understand when dealing with truly unexplained phenomena. And I'll just close with a couple of quotes here from some of my sort of skeptical heroes. Carl Sagan, of course, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A wonderful one from James Randi, who, by the way, had a documentary come out on PBS very recently called An Honest Liar. Check out that documentary. An Honest Liar is the title. It is an amazing documentary. It's kind of about the life of James Randi and sort of his pursuit of skepticism and testing the paranormal and so on. It's a wonderful documentary. It's very personal to him, too. It's great. I won't give it away. But he has this quote in that documentary. It sort of sums the whole thing up. It says, no matter how smart or well-educated you are, you can be deceived. And I think we make a big mistake if we ever put ourselves into a mindset where we think that we cannot be deceived, even skeptics, especially skeptics. So, very wise words from Randy. And then to close, I'll finish with one more from my skeptical colleague Phil Plate, who said that it's so hilarious the way he put this. He says, you know what? The universe is cool enough without having to make up crap about it. And so I'll just finish with that one.
Yeah, I know. I remember when I was a teenager, my next door neighbor got some tickets to a magic show for me and some of my friends, and we went with him. And I remember I was one of these loudmouths, and I went up. I was saying, "Oh, that I know how that's done." And so the guy called me up on stage, and the first 7 or 8 tricks I explained. I was able to say, "Well, yeah, you did this," but then there came like that 8th or 9th trick, and I couldn't explain it. And it and but I knew he wasn't really magical, but it was always one of those things that I remember that I got so full of myself to think that, oh, I could explain every trick. And I was only 14 or 15 at the time, and I don't even remember what the trick was, but it always stuck with me that that I couldn't explain that one trick, and that failure always stuck with me. But anyway, I want to thank both James and Matt for spending some time talking about this. I'll have links to both of their websites below. And if you found this interesting, maybe give them a contact, or if you want to collect some money, maybe contact James if you have some real stuff. And again, I just want to thank both of you. It's been an interesting discussion.
Thank you very much.